Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the film Constantine. Now, there are going to be spoilers, so if you haven't already seen the movie and you don't want anything at all spoiled for you, what you're going to want to do is shut this video off right now, go away, watch the film, and then come back later after you've seen it and watch this video. By the way, you're in for a little treat because it is a very, very good film. For those who are still here, let's take a trip down memory lane. The year is 2005. It is years before political propaganda becomes the order of the day in modern cinema. We are still 3 years away from the beginning of the plague that is cinematic universes. We were 2-3 years before Iron Man was released. And this is the year before DC has really sort of fallen into a major state of decline. In fact, you could argue that this is a bit of a cinematic high point for DC because not only does Constantine come out, but that same year, Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy kicks off with Batman Begins. In that year, one of the best comic book movies ever made, in my humble opinion, right up there with the Batman trilogy, right up there with Road to Perdition, Constantine is released. This is a great film. I can't rave about this movie enough. I have loved it from the very first moment I saw it, and even though it took a while for it to gain a bit of a cult and a much stronger sort of mainstream following, this was always a good film, and it was really, I think, only a matter of time before it actually took off. It stars Keanu Reeves, Rachel Weisz, Shia LaBeouf, Tilda Swinton. It is so good because it is so well written, so well acted, so well crafted. It's a really, really great piece of storytelling, and I think what makes it so excellent is the fact that it has an authentic mythology, a true mythology. Now, yes, this is a sci-fi fantasy, a supernatural fantasy film, but the mythology speaks to the truth of the human condition. It speaks to the truth of reality in a very profound and important way, and the film itself, the artistry that surrounds that, is really, really well crafted. It's now 15 years later and this film still holds up, and 15 years from now this film will still hold up then as well, because it is an engaging and very well told story. This is a film where you don't need to know anything about Constantine. You don't need to know anything about the comic books. In fact, you might have never ever read a comic book in your life. You might have no interest at all in any of that sort of stuff, but you could sit down, watch this movie, and enjoy a really good cinematic experience. That is the hallmark of a really well-crafted film. It's got great cinematography. I love the use of things like the bird's eye camera view. There's a great shot early on in the film that I really, really love that stuck out to me, I think about the second or third time I rewatched it, and that's when he goes to exorcise that young girl who is demon-possessed at the very start of the film, and he puts down his still-lit, still-burning cigarette on a chest of drawers in her bedroom, and the focal point of the camera shifts very sharply onto that still lit burning cigarette, and then back to the action in the room. And that's a great piece of foreshadowing, by the way, because those cigarettes obviously are connected very deeply to the disease that he has, and they're a big part of the story. So it's a great little moment of foreshadowing. There's another scene early on in the film with this glorious dolly zoom as Rachel Weisz is walking into this church, and the camera's behind her. She's walking towards the sanctuary, and there is this large icon type artwork, and it speaks to, again, another piece of foreshadowing. It speaks to the fact that she is in the midst of this cosmic battle between good and evil, between Satan and God, that is playing out, and she's a central player, and she's about to step right into the midst of this. And it's very appropriate then that we have not only this glorious dolly zoom, but we're following her as she is literally stepping towards a visual imagery, a piece of artwork in the sanctuary of a church that represents that very cosmic battle. There's another great scene I love later in the film where Angela is pulled backwards by Gabriel through all of those walls in that building. The thing I really love about the visual styling of this film is that I think it captures in a really great way the essence of comic book imagery. So the cinematography, things like Dutch angles and bird's eye views, and these sort of unique ways in which comic book artists tell their story. They obviously have one frame at a time to work with. It's a still frame, and so you get lots of interesting and unique perspectives in comic books that are not how you would normally do things in cinema. And this piece of cinema actually captures the essence of that without going so overboard with the stylistic stuff that it pulls you out of the film or it becomes a distraction. It's just part of the story, and it's used as a visual medium to help tell and enhance that story. Every character in this film is fascinating. Even the minor characters who may only have 1 or 2 minutes in totality of screen time throughout the entire story, they're still very interesting. They feel like characters who have a very well fleshed out backstory, and they're all unique. They've got their own little quirks and everything else that makes them different. None of them feel tropey. None of them feel like cliches. And you really get that sense that off screen, a much more complex and fleshed out character and backstory exists. And so when they appear in this film, even if it's only briefly, they are interesting and engaging to watch, and they all helped to craft, and they play this unique role in populating this fascinating little mythological world. Keanu Reeves as John Constantine is excellent. This is a role that I think could have gone badly wrong, because there's a real darkness to this character, but if the darkness had become too consuming, I think it would have just dragged the whole movie down. It would have become morose. It would have become like an emotional black hole that you'd probably walked out of and thought, man, I need a couple of Prozacs to get me back on my feet again after watching this film. But you never get that with this movie. Keanu Reeves is pitch perfect. He presents the cynicism, the nihilism, without ever allowing that to overwhelm his character. And the way he's directed and the way the film is crafted and put together, it never becomes too overwhelming. There's always that sense that there's hope here for this character. You never ever lose the sense of hope, and I think that's important. Authentic mythologies always have a sense of hope about them, even when they are touching on darker subject matter, and this film captures that really well. This character is, I think, played to perfection by Keanu Reeves. The other thing I think that's interesting about this character is you get a sense at times that perhaps Reeves is channeling Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry, and that makes a lot of sense, because really, when you think about it, John Constantine is the Dirty Harry of this supernatural world. He's this jaded supernatural enforcer. And so it's really perfect that he does that. Rachel Weisz as the character of Angela, and obviously playing her twin sister Isabel as well, but she is the character of Angela primarily in this story. She is also excellent, just pitch perfect, the way she plays this role, the way it's directed. This is a very good casting decision, but it's not just the casting, it's what comes next. And I think the character of Angela could have fallen into all sorts of mistakes that would have actually made a mess of things for this film. So first of all, she could have been far too emotive, or she could have got very tropey as the damsel in distress, but she doesn't ever do that. Secondly, she could have been too dark and cynical and jaded herself. Thirdly, there could have been a real temptation here, I think, to make her into like a female version of John Constantine. But they don't do that. She's her own unique character. And what I really love about her in this film is that even though she's a strong female character, there's no loss of the feminine genius. Her femininity is still ever present in this role. It's not like they've thought to themselves, okay, let's make her a strong female character by making her just like a man. Instead, what they've done is they've actually presented what I think is an authentic vision of femininity, where that sort of sense of motherhood never really disappears from her as a character. The thing that lies at the heart of the feminine genius, her nurturing, caring, loving heart, is still very present. But she's not a meek, mild, timid character. She's a very, very strong character in this, and I think she's really, really well played, really well acted, and again, a very, very good casting decision, I think. I also think that the ending was great, and the way in which it happened was really good. They don't end up getting each other, this sort of tropey thing of the male and the female lead who end up in a romantic, happily ever after type relationship at the end of a film. There is a romantic relationship that is beginning, that is burgeoning at the end of this film, but you feel that it has been well earned, and also importantly, you get a sense that this is not the end of the journey, it's just the beginning, and that there is a lot more that is required to make this work, and that there is still virtue and commitment on their part to actually make this thing a healthy, functioning relationship. It's not like all of a sudden John Constantine, for example, has been transformed into a character that he was not throughout the rest of the film. We haven't sort of suddenly stepped into the twilight zone where he is now the perfect friend, lover, and companion. Clearly, he's got a lot of work to do to cut off those rough edges and all that cynicism, and you get that sense of that even still at the end of this film, even as this romantic relationship comes together. They're not sort of getting each other, winning each other as a prize, like often happens in a very tropey way in other films. Peter Stormare as Lucifer, gosh, talk about chewing the scenery. This guy is phenomenal, and one of the things I really love about his performance is the way in which he just oozes the sin of pride throughout that period where he is on screen, and that's the way it's supposed to be. The chief sin of the devil is pride. He fell from heaven because of his pride, and you really get the sense of pride, the sin of pride just oozing from the pores of Lucifer in this portrayal. The other thing that I really loved that was a nice little touch was the fact that he appears dressed all in white. He's in this white suit. That's very, very appropriate, and I'd like to think that that's deliberate and that it's a callback to this idea from Christian doctrine that goes all the way back to the Christian scriptures, which talk about Satan being an angel of light. And what is meant by that is he is a great con man. He appears as an angel of light in order to trick and to deceive and to con people, and you get the sense of the con man in this particular character. There's an old saying that I really love that goes a little something like this: the devil doesn't have a red cape, horns, and a pitchfork. The devil looks like everything you've ever wanted, and you really get that sense of this with this particular portrayal of Lucifer, which we see at the end, the climax of this movie. Shia LaBeouf is great in Constantine. Not the best role he's ever had, but I think it's one of his best in this type of film. Other films I've seen him in, it just feels like he hasn't been well directed, and you get a sense there's just too much of that sort of sarcastic or the OCD Cosmo Kramer type stuff. There's none of that really in this film. They've used his strengths really, really well. There's just the right amount of sarcasm, and even more importantly, his character has a meaningful character arc. He starts as the young apprentice who thinks he's better than he is and wants the top job straight away. But by the end of it, there's been a genuine sort of transformation and arc in his character. And it's really great to see this in a secondary character in a film like this. He actually gets a meaningful and complete character arc. Now, by the way, if you haven't watched this film to the very end of the credits and watched that final scene that's hidden there, you haven't seen the completion of his character arc. And I know people who have done this. They've just shut off the film, as you often do when the credits start rolling, not realizing that at the very end of that credit roll there's another scene, and Shia LaBeouf's character comes to the fullness of completion with his character arc. So if you haven't seen it, go back and watch that. And I think it was, to me, it made sense. It was a great choice, I thought. It made perfect sense, and it fits in so well with this mythology. Tilda Swinton, who plays the Archangel Gabriel, she's great in this. Now, the reason why I think she's great is not just because of her physicality. There's something unique about her physicality, her physical presence, the way that she is bodily, that just sort of is pitch perfect, I think, for playing an angel. But it's also the way that she plays this and the way the character is written. You get this sense by the end of it that she has this far too simplistic, childish naivety, and that's really what motivated her to make the very, very bad error that she made, a very serious error in judgment, and joining the forces of darkness. And you realize at the end why she's done this. And it's very subtle. It's not spelled out with some sort of very unsubtle form of exposition. It's just there in the way the character is, in that sense of, oh my gosh, she's really naive. She hasn't actually understood the full picture of the cosmic battle, the struggle that she's actually caught up in, and that's why she's made this very bad decision. Another thing I really love about Constantine is the imagery and what you might say are the stylistic sensibilities about the way things are done on screen. The world that these characters inhabit is, to me, is a fascinating one. It's our world, but it's not really our world, and that's very appropriate because these are characters who are really fighting a battle that is taking place in a parallel world. And so it's appropriate that you get the sense that even in the physical world that they inhabit in this film, there is also that strong sense that it's a world within a world in and of itself. Think about things like the bowling alley or John Constantine's apartment. And by the way, I love that little flourish where they have the Dave Brubeck quartet playing Take 5 on the record player at the beginning of the film when we first go into his apartment. Very important jazz album, just a little side note, that helped to popularize jazz in the mainstream. That's a side note, so let's get back to the film. The point I was making is that these characters inhabit a world that feels really, really well fleshed out. Now, this is not Lord of the Rings and it's not Star Wars type world building, but it is still a very complete, and I think it has its own unique little sort of flourishes that all add to the storytelling and the mythology that's going on here in this movie. That crucifix gun that Constantine uses is great, and I'll tell you what I like about that is not just the visual styling of that particular weapon, but the way in which it is used in this story. I think in lesser hands, this film could have ended up with a situation where John Constantine was carrying that weapon as like a signature weapon that he used on anything and anyone. Instead, though, this gun, the big guns literally, are only really completed and put together and brought out in the final scene, the big crescendo of the movie. And the way that it's used is great. That scene in the hospital where he triggers the sprinkler system and there's this great visual and the use of slow-mo and everything else as he uses that weapon. And what I love about it is it's this sort of one-time thing. It's just, you see that particular style of action set piece and you don't keep seeing it. It's not repeated constantly in the film. And so what happens is when we get to the crescendo, it actually feels like a crescendo. It feels like something more serious. There's been a build up to this moment. It hasn't been a constant series of action set pieces where he's used this whopping great crucifix cannon over and over and over again so that it doesn't carry the same weight and emotional meaning as it does when he uses it towards the end of the film. The other thing I really love is the fact that he's got this variety of weapons in his arsenal, and when you think about it, a lot of them are simply defensive, and they're all just so unique. A beetle in a box. What a great concept. The idea of that rag that he wraps around his hand and then lights on fire to ward off that demon horde. These are great little concepts, and what they do is you don't even realize it, but subconsciously, this is telling you something. This is telling you that there is a real breadth and a real depth to this universe, to this mythology, to this world. There is a lot to this world. There is tradition here, there's history, and it's a lot bigger than what you see on screen. None of these things are necessarily explained to you in great detail, but you're taking them in, and as you see those lots of little details on the screen, it's showing you that this is a very complex world that this character inhabits. And they do this, as I said, without making the Star Wars prequel mistake of explaining every little thing in gory detail to you. I love the depiction of hell in this. It's very Dante-esque in the sense you've got layers. You go down through the layers of hell, but also there's this idea of the way in which the visual representation of that takes place. The layer or the circle at the very top, if you like, is our world basically, but with a constant firestorm raging and that sense of isolation. And the way it's depicted, it's pretty simple. It's nothing too complex, but it works well because what it does is it gives you that sense of hell as being a place where all that is good has been stripped away and you are isolated, you are alone, you are tormented, you are in a situation that would be the worst possible place to be. And you really get that sense, and it's done simply and well. Nothing's ever in excess. And even the little moments, there's lots of little sort of, as we're traveling down through the layers, and they don't hang around on anything too much. Again, this could have got very, very dark, gory, brutal, nihilistic. It could have been just this horrible, another very horrible black hole in the film, the depiction of hell, but it's not. And it's done well enough for you to know this is a horrible place that you don't want to go. The other thing about this film is the way in which the visual storytelling unfolds with lots of little flourishes, these little cinematic flourishes that you probably didn't even really notice, and maybe even if you've seen the film a couple of times you might not have picked up on, but they are all enhancing and adding to the storytelling. So I'll give you some examples of this. Think about that cat that we see when John Constantine is in Angela's apartment and he has the tub of water he puts his feet into. He has the cat by the head. He's looking into its eyes as he's about to cross over into hell to try and solve more of the mystery. And he tells Angela that cats are half in, half out. Now, what's interesting about that is if you go back to the very opening sequence of the film, you will remember that Angela was having what at first appears to be a nightmare, but quite clearly now appears to be some sort of supernatural vision of some kind about her sister Isabel and her suicide on the top of the hospital. And when she awakens from that in her bed, who's there right beside her walking across the front of the frame? It's none other than her cat. It's a powerful piece of symbolism of being half in and half out, which is what John Constantine tells us they are. And it's also very appropriate for her character because she's a twin and her twin sister is trapped in hell. She's half in and half out herself. There's also in that scene, as she leaves the room and she closes the door behind her, everything goes into slow motion, the door closes, and then John crosses over into hell. Again, it's a great little visual flourish because this is actually true. It's a metaphor for what's actually happening in the story. He's crossing over, he's going through a doorway from our world to the supernatural world, and now the two of them, they're in separate rooms back in the real world, but also in the supernatural world there's been this division, this split as well. They're now in two separate rooms. He's in the supernatural room, she's in the natural room. And so there's this great visual metaphor going on in that scene. The fire crackling in the background that we see and hear when we first meet the angel Gabriel in that library, in that priest's rectory. Remember the scene where John Constantine rudely pushes in ahead of Angela and he's talking to Gabriel, and Gabriel seems to be reveling and delighting in the fact that he is going to hell, and she's talking to him and telling him and reminding him about the future that awaits him. And by the way, that's a great little moment of foreshadowing. It's telling us that something's not right with this character. We should all be a little bit weirded out by the fact that an archangel is reveling and delighting and telling a human being that they're going to hell. There's something not right about this, and ironically we realize at the end of the film exactly why that was not right and what was really going on there. But the point is that what we have in that scene, as she's telling him and reminding him about the fires of hell, we have an actual fire in the fireplace that is burning and crackling away. It's a nice little touch, a little visual flourish. The hospital pool. You may not have noticed this, but if you are someone who's a little bit more astute, you will realize that the hospital pool, where the final battle takes place, is actually in the shape of a cross. This is the cross upon which, or in this case in which, the final battle, which ultimately is all about self-sacrifice, takes place. And it's through self-sacrifice that the final victory is won. Again, this goes back to the Christian understanding of reality, where the final victory is actually won on the cross by Jesus Christ. And Christ wins that battle through the ultimate self-sacrifice of his own life. And by the way, that's exactly what happens in the climax of this film as well with Constantine. Papa Midnight, there's that great scene, and it's a very little brief thing, and it's quite subtle, and it's not loudly spoken, so you may have missed this or not picked up on it. But Papa Midnight tells John Constantine that he's going to pray for him before he goes into that final battle, and he raises his hands over him, and then he starts praying in Latin, and he says, Deus miserere nobis. Now, if you know your Latin, you will know that Deus miserere nobis means God have mercy. And that's what he prays over Constantine before he goes into the final battle. And guess what happens? At the end of the final battle, that is exactly what God does. He has mercy on John Constantine. There's so many of these great little flourishes in this film that I really love that just all add to the cinematic storytelling of this mythology and the visual representation, the symbolism, the metaphors, and everything else that all complete, I think, what is a really, really great and engaging story. Which brings me to the heart of why I think this film is ultimately so good and why I love it so much. What makes this film great is the mythology. It's an authentic mythology. It's a well-crafted mythology, and ultimately it's true. Now, what do I mean by that? Because obviously this is a supernatural fantasy film. So it's not true in the sense that it's happening in the real world. It's a fictional tale. But it contains and it speaks to profoundly important truths. Now, this mythology ultimately is a Christian mythology, even though it strays well away from the path of Christian orthodoxy at times. It's got ideas and concepts in it that are antithetical to orthodox Christian doctrine and theology, ideas that are so outside of it they would be considered heresies in some cases. Let me give you some of the examples of these. At the beginning of the film, we see that demon-possessed girl, and the way that John Constantine exorcises that demon-possessed girl is by using a pagan ritual. And the idea that you could use paganism as a way to exorcise the demons from a person, it's completely antithetical to Christianity. In fact, Christianity would say that by doing that, what you are doing is you are simply inviting more of a demonic presence into that situation. The only way to resolve a demonic presence is by going to the only true source of all that is powerful and good in the universe, which is God, and asking Him to actually exorcise the person, to cast out the demons. You wouldn't use paganism, that would simply invite more problems. The idea of suicide being a mortal sin. Now, yes, that is correct. Suicide is a mortal sin, but there's an important caveat that's missing in this film, and it really is quite important in this film, and that's this idea that for a sin to be mortal, it has to be freely chosen. And a person who is suffering mental illness, psychological confusion, some sort of delusion, who's under some sort of torment or anguish that is so serious that they lose all sense of reality and they think that taking their life is the only way to actually solve their problems, that's not a freely made choice. And in that situation, Christianity would say, you don't have a mortal sin, and that's exactly what the situation is in this particular story. The idea of the devil having a son. No, that's not at all consistent with Christianity. The idea that God and the devil are sort of polar opposites is not correct. Now, they are obviously polar opposites as far as good versus evil goes, but they are not mirror images of each other. The devil doesn't create things. The devil is the entity who steals, who robs, who kills, who destroys, who undermines the created order, who takes what is good, who mimics it, who robs it of its goodness, who uses it against people, but he is not a creator, he's an imitator. The idea of there being extra verses or books in the Bible that we see in this story, the idea that there are in the supernatural world a different version of the Bible which contains more books or more text that's not in the natural world version of the Bible. Again, that's not true. The Bible is the Bible. We've got what we've got. There it is in black and white. The idea of angels and demons having a constant free will that allows them to actually choose at any point to switch sides from the side of goodness and truth to the side of evil and darkness, like we see happening with Gabriel. The Christian doctrine is that there was one choice that the angels had and made. They are angelic persons. They have a will, but they made a choice, and that choice was a oncer. You make the choice and then that's it. And so a third of the angels made the choice to follow Lucifer when he tried to rebel and overthrow heaven for his own proud, pride-filled sake and dominance and control. And of course he failed and he was swept from heaven, the Christian scriptures say, by the archangel Michael. And the other 2/3 of the angels, they stayed. But it's not like they have the ability to keep switching sides like we see in this film. Now, despite those concepts, which are clearly not consistent with Orthodox Christian doctrine and thought, the mythology in this film still remains a Christian mythology. How can that be so? Well, what I mean by that is that it doesn't become a mythology of nihilism or relativism or Gnosticism. This is a world with clear objective truth and boundaries. This is a world where God is still God and the devil is still the devil. There is good and there is evil. This is a world where good priests still have legitimate power. There's references to that in this film, about the fact that priests still wield power in this particular mythology. This is ultimately a Christian mythology, and it speaks to, I think, something profoundly important and true about the human experience. So here are some of the truths that we see in this mythology that I think really matter. There is the important truth about free will. In this film, Constantine talks about demons as being influence peddlers. That's what he calls them. In other words, they can't control you unless you surrender your will over to them. They can influence you, but you still have a choice in this about what you're going to follow and what you're not going to follow, who you're going to listen to and who you're not going to listen to. There's another great scene as well where he carries out that quote-unquote exorcism of Balthazar. And of course, Balthazar begins to freak out because he thinks he's about to go to heaven, and I guess he doesn't want to go there because he knows there's going to be some sort of punishment probably waiting for him because he's a demon. And so he begins to react very badly when John Constantine begins to say the Christian rite of exorcism. Now, at the end of that, though, Constantine tells him that he's been an idiot. You have to actually repent, he says to him. Basically, you can't be forced into redemption. You can't be forced into these things. You have to actually make a free will choice. Without repentance, without a willing turning away from sin, you're not being grabbed against your free will and taken and controlled and manipulated in any other way. Yes, there is influence. Yes, there is temptation, but you still ultimately have the decision to make about what you are going to do or not going to do. The idea in this film that evil is the privation of good. We see this with the depiction of hell. It's a world where all that is good and true and beautiful has been stripped away. We see this with the depiction of the Spear of Longinus, which, by the way, is basically like the Ring of Power from the Lord of the Rings. It's this powerful thing. It's this representation of sin, ultimately, that if you wield it, you wield this power and domination over other people. But what we see with that spear is that it destroys those who wield it. Those who come into contact with it, they are stripped of their goodness. Their souls are taken from them and they are deprived. There's a privation of good that happens to those who wield this. We see as that character earlier on is walking with the spear back in towards the city, and the cattle start dying, the grass starts browning off and dying around him. It's that sense of evil being the privation of good. This idea that darkness is not a thing in and of itself. Darkness is the absence of something else. It's the absence of the good of light. And this very Christian idea that evil is the absence of good, just like darkness is the absence of light. Another important truth in the mythology of Constantine is this idea that desires without the restraint of virtue fall into evil, and very, very destructive evil. We see this so clearly with the death of that alcoholic priest when he goes into the bottle store and he's smashing open bottle after bottle of alcohol and trying to drink them, but nothing's coming out. Now, of course, he's being deceived and alcohol is actually coming out. He doesn't realize this, and what he's doing is he's drowning himself in his desires. It's a very, very powerful depiction of this idea that desire that is unchecked by virtue is extremely evil and extremely destructive for those who get caught up in that cycle. Another really important and very, very pinnacle truth in this mythology is the idea that self-giving love is the only path to human flourishing. Self-giving love is the path to redemption, to completion, to the fullness of the human experience. And we see this so very, very clearly in the character of John Constantine, who at the start of the film is destined for hell, but by the end of the film, he has been redeemed. And how does that redemption ultimately come about? It only comes after he makes that pure sacrifice. He's about to go off to hell. There's nothing in this for him. But he chooses to try and save Angela's sister Isabel, who is trapped currently in hell. And he sacrifices himself willingly with nothing in it for him at all. It's a pure sacrifice. He knows and he believes at this point that he is going to hell regardless, but he still makes that choice. And by the way, that's a massive transformation of his character. It's a very big character arc. At the beginning of the film, remember, he's very selfish. By the end of the film, it's total self-sacrificial love. It's total self-giving from him. But at the start of the film, he won't even hold an elevator for Angela. He's trying to push in ahead of her very rudely because he's so selfish, so self-interested. It's all about him. But by the end of the film, he's giving of himself for the good of another. And it is that which ultimately completely redeems and transforms him as a person. It's the thing that allows him to achieve the pinnacle of the human experience, to actually find his salvation. And this is the great mystery in life. This is the great paradox, that we actually find our life and our completion by giving ourselves away. When we give of ourselves to something greater than ourselves, we truly find ourselves. And especially when what we're doing is giving of ourselves in relationship to others. It's the most meaningful form of self-giving. Another really important, I think very beautiful truth, and it's something that really resonates with me in my life, that is found in the story of Constantine, is this idea that God draws straight with crooked lines. Think about the characters in this film. They are not what you would call perfect paragons of virtue. Constantine, not at all. The alcoholic priest. These are characters. I'm talking here about the guys on the side of goodness. These are characters with these flaws, these very serious flaws and deficiencies, but still God is choosing to draw his straight lines using these crooked characters, these people who have these deficiencies. If you and I were choosing an army to fight the horde of darkness, I'm pretty sure we'd probably go looking for the most virtuous and what we think are the most well-qualified characters to be in the army of goodness. You probably wouldn't necessarily pick these guys as your first choice, but that's the whole point. And even in this film, we see this really important truth of God being able to make good come of evil. That even these evil and dark situations like Isabel's suicide, if people are willing to cooperate, then God is able to use that to achieve good in the world. It's a really quite, I think, a profoundly important and beautiful truth for all of us, especially those who have been less than perfect in this life and perhaps struggle with the sense of guilt about the mistakes, the sins, the baggage that we carry around with us. Another thing I really love, and I think it's a very important truth in this mythology, is the depiction of God. Now, there's something really, really interesting when you think about the way God versus Lucifer is depicted in this film. So first of all, you've got an actor playing the role of Lucifer, but you don't have an actor playing the role of God. This is not like Bruce Almighty. Imagine if Morgan Freeman had turned up at the end of this film. I think it would have done two things that are really big problems for this story. Number one is, all of a sudden, you would have really associated the idea of God with that actor. Your fixation, your focus would have been on the actor, I think, rather than what is really true and good about this story and the way in which it depicts God. And that brings me to my second point. We would have lost sense of this profoundly important truth that God is like pure being. God is all-powerful. God is present in a way that is completely different to how persons are present in the world. And it also creates this important dichotomy between Lucifer and God. At the start of the film, you can sort of easily fall prey to the mistake of thinking that God and the devil are equals and they're opposites, but by the end you realize that's not the case at all. And there's that great scene as Lucifer tries to drag off the soul of John Constantine down into hell, but God puts his hand on him. Now, we don't see the hand, but we know the hand is there because all of a sudden Lucifer can't drag him. Despite his best efforts, he can't pull him any further, and you see the ground around him. You realize the force that's being exerted at that point. The ground around him begins to ripple up and break apart as he is held firmly in place. Now, you don't see the hand of God, you don't hear a voice, you don't see a figure, there's no actor there, but what this is telling you is something very, very important. It's telling you that in actual fact, God is all-powerful. God is not simply an equal opposite version of the devil. God is the all-powerful pure being. And this is really important because this is actually how traditional Christian theism has understood God as well. Christian philosophy from the very beginning has understood that God is the being who holds everything in being, who holds all of existence in being. And so I think it would really undermine that to have God turning up as, I don't know, say Morgan Freeman or someone like that. You also get that sense as John Constantine is being elevated, ascending up into heaven, and you see the pure light behind him. There's that great little flourish with the birdie, which I thought was quite funny as well. But aside from that, there's this pure light that you see emanating from heaven. Again, this idea of God being pure light, all-powerful, all-consuming. He is the light which casts out the darkness. And it's really important because what it is, it's a depiction that shows not just the traditional understanding of who God is within Christian theism, but also what it does is it shows you that these two players in the story are not actually equals at all. And lastly, but not leastly, in fact most importantly of all, is this important truth that God works in mysterious ways. We hear John actually enunciating this at the very end of the film in his final monologue, and he adds that little flourish where he says that basically some people don't like this, but this is how it is. God works in mysterious ways. He is directly quoting Christian scriptures there. And this whole idea that the way God works in the world is not the way that we would necessarily choose for him to work in the world, but still there is a plan being outworked. There's great mystery around this. There's great complexity to this. This encompasses all sorts of things that often we don't really fully grasp, and also things that we would look at in very simplistic ways and get wrong. And this is what you get the sense of in this film, this idea that it's evil that is simplistic, that lacks nuance. Think about Gabriel and the evil of Gabriel in this film. It's simplistic thinking. It's a lack of seeing the fullness of the mystery and leaning into that causes the Archangel Gabriel to choose to do this evil thing, that motivates the evil, that sort of kicks off the major plot, that sort of is happening in Constantine. And this idea opposing that is that God is working in a way that is complex, that is mysterious, and even at times it seems like he might not be at work, but still something bigger and deeper is going on here. And for me as a person of faith, I really, really appreciated that. It's something in my life that I lean into. And when I am confronted by the problem of suffering and evil in the world, and now, yes, I understand the philosophical reasoning for that and the way in which without suffering and evil there could be no free will. If God intervened and took away all suffering and evil, he would have to take away and prevent us from making any choice that could lead to suffering and evil for ourselves or for others, and in doing so we would have no free will. We would have no choice but to love him, to love other people. We would have no free will, and without free will you can't make a free decision, and if you can't freely choose another, you can't actually love another. For love to be love, it has to be freely chosen, freely given. So I understand all that philosophical argument, but still in the real world, when you are confronted by moments of great suffering and darkness and evil, these are still challenging mysteries to be in the face of. And as a person of faith, I lean into that, and I lean into this important truth, this idea that God is working in mysterious ways, and that at the end of all time, I will understand how this was all playing out, even though at the time it might have seemed odd, mysterious, it might have seemed challenging, daunting, something that I didn't understand or was even confused by. And you really get the sense of that. In fact, that's really the story of this film. Look, I could keep talking about this movie all day. I think you get the point. I really, really love Constantine. I think it is one of the best comic book movies ever made. It's a great film. The reason it holds up, as I said 15 years later, is because it is such a well-made film with such a well-told and engaging story that has an authentic mythology which contains some deep truths at its heart. It's not about politics. It's not about superficial things. There is something deep and important that is wrapped up in this, what at first appears to be a simplistic sort of supernatural fantasy comic book story. It's actually much more than that when you scratch the surface. It's a shame to me that it actually didn't get more of a following when it was first released, and that it took a while for it to actually take off. But I think that's, like all good stories probably, that initially they may not receive the credit that they are due. It takes a bit of time for people to actually develop a love or to discover a film and to really understand how good it actually is. The good thing is that now it has a lot more of an audience following than what it did initially. With all of the talk recently of the Constantine sequel, I have to say I'm a little bit concerned, because I worry about what they would actually look like and what would be done to this mythology in the current cinematic context, where often very destructive things are done to previously great filmic properties. However, regardless of what does or does not happen with a sequel, the simple fact is we will always have the 2005 film Constantine, and it is a truly great piece of cinema. Thanks for watching this video. If you're not already a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that little notifications bell as well. If you enjoyed this content, then please support the channel. You can do that using the PayPal link below. If you want to make a one-off contribution because you enjoyed this particular video, you can do that using the PayPal link in the video description. There's also a PayPal link found at the top of my YouTube homepage. Alternately, you can become a regular patron by supporting the channel with a regular contribution on Patreon. That's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. As little as $1 a month is all it takes, or as much as you'd like to give. A huge thank you to everyone who is supporting this channel. Without you, today's video would not have been possible. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.